Let us revisit some of the definitions that we have looked at. Once again, what is market equilibrium? It is the price at which quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. Then we know what is a shortage. It is a situation in which quantity demanded is greater than quantity supplied, and this happens when the market price is lower than equilibrium price. Then there is a situation of surplus, a situation in which quantity demanded is less than quantity supplied, and this happens when the market price is higher than the equilibrium price.
Now what we get into is why do prices change and why does quantity traded change? And there are two things you should know about price change. This can happen when the market is not in equilibrium. This is the first thing we'll discuss. Why do prices change? And another aspect we'll look at is why do prices change when market is already in equilibrium? And once the market is in equilibrium, there should be no tendency for prices to change. And because equilibrium, the way we have looked at it, is pretty stable.
Let us revisit the diagram we had used in the previous video. We know the blue colored line is the demand curve, the red colored line is the supply curve, and these two intersect at this point. At wherever they intersect, that simply means quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. And let us just drop this point to the horizontal axis, and we know quantity demanded is 6 million cups of coffee, quantity supplied is also 6 million cups of coffee, or in other words, quantity traded is 6 million cups of coffee. At what price? At a price of $3. So when the price is $3 per cup, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, or in other words, this point of intersection represents equilibrium, which we denote by letter E. And let us call this equilibrium price as PE. Now, suppose the economy or the market is not in equilibrium, and suppose the price for the market for coffee is $1 per cup, or in other words, price is lower than the equilibrium price. In such a case, when the price is $1 per cup, how much is quantity supplied? It is 2 million cups of coffee. How much is quantity demanded? It is 10 million cups of coffee. Or what we have is a shortage of this good. Now look at the following. At a price of $1 per cup, there are more buyers than what is available. And if prices can change easily, what is going to happen is seller is going to increase the price of coffee, and as price of coffee increases, what happens to quantity demand supplied of coffee? It increases as well. What happens to quantity demanded of coffee? It starts to fall. And so when price rises, what happens is supply will increase and demand will fall, and this will go on happening till we hit a point where demand equals supply, or we have equilibrium. And you already know when demand is greater than supply, we have a situation of shortage. Now look at another price. Let's call this PH, which is higher than equilibrium price. And at this price of $5 per cup, How much is quantity demanded? It is 2 million cups of coffee. How much is quantity supplied? It is 10 million cups of coffee. Or in other words, supply is greater than demand, or what we have is a surplus in production, or a situation of inventory buildup, or what we call excess supply. When the businesses or sellers are not able to sell all that they have, in that case, one of the ways they'll try to entice the customers is they will lower the price. And as they lower the price, what happens? Quantity supplied starts to fall. What happens to quantity demanded? It starts to increase as price falls. And this will go on happening till we hit this equilibrium point. And so when we have a situation of surplus or supply is greater than demand, chances are prices will fall and they'll go on falling till we hit equilibrium. And on the other hand, when we have a shortage, in such a case, there'll be a tendency for prices to rise. And as prices rise, quantity supplied will increase, quantity demanded will fall, and eventually we'll hit equilibrium. So what we have is an equilibrium point, and if you are out of equilibrium, the market will adjust in a manner that we eventually get back to equilibrium point, or in other words, equilibrium is stable in terms of the model we are looking at. So one of the reasons as to why prices may change is when we are in a situation of shortage or surplus. In such a case, the prices will change, and when prices change, market adjusts, and eventually we hit equilibrium.
Now we answer the second part, and that is, if the market is already in equilibrium, why would prices change? And here what we are getting into is an area called comparative statics, where we are comparing outcomes under two or more equilibrium points. And why do prices change when the market is already in equilibrium? This could happen because of shifts of demand or supply curves. And what we'll do in subsequently or next is look at increase in demand, what are the consequences of that, an increase in supply, and then the opposite of that, and then a combination of A and B. So let us look at each of these one at a time.
Once again, we have the original diagram, and the subscript O represents the situation in the original situation. So given a demand and supply curves, we have equilibrium in the original situation, price at equilibrium, PE 0, quantity traded at equilibrium, QE 0. Now, look at the following. Suppose for some reason the demand curve shifts to the right, or what we have is a new demand curve, and let us call this D1. The supply curve stays at the same position, so we still have S0. And so we have a new demand curve and the original supply curve, and wherever they intersect, we have a new equilibrium point. Let's call it E1. And at new equilibrium point, we have a new price at equilibrium. Let's call this PE1. PE1. And then we have new equilibrium quantity traded at this new equilibrium point. Let's call it QE1. Now what you observe is the following. As demand curve shifts to the right, what happens to equilibrium price? It increases. Whatever happens to equilibrium quantity traded, it increases. So let's just write this down. When there is an increase in demand, there is an increase in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity traded. Now I'll not do this, but you can figure this out on your own. When the demand curve will fall or shift to the left, In such a case, we would expect a decrease in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity traded. We once again use the diagram in the original situation. So this diagram represents market equilibrium in the original situation. And now suppose for the some reason the supply curve shifts to the right or becomes S1, or what this represents is an increase in supply. The demand curve stays the same. So now new supply curve and the original demand curve, wherever these two intersect, we have new equilibrium point. Let's call this E1. We take this point to the vertical axis, and what we have determined is the new equilibrium price. Let's call it PE1. And what we have also determined is the new equilibrium quantity traded. Let me just straighten this. And let's call this QE1. So what we observe here is the following. When the supply increases or the supply curve shifts to the right, there is a decrease in equilibrium price and an increase in quantity traded. So let's write this down. Increase in supply will cause a decrease in equilibrium price and an increase in quantity traded. Once again, I won't do this, but you can figure this out on your own. When there is a decrease in supply, we would expect an increase in equilibrium price and a decrease in quantity traded. What we have learned from comparative static exercise is the following. When there is a shift of the demand curve, equilibrium price and quantity traded move in the same direction. For example, if there is an increase in demand, we would expect an increase in equilibrium price and an increase in quantity traded. And if there is a decrease in demand, we would expect a decrease in equilibrium price and a decrease in equilibrium quantity traded. As far as the supply curve shift goes, price and quantity traded at equilibrium move in opposite direction. For example, if there is an increase in supply, we would expect a decrease in equilibrium price and an increase in equilibrium quantity traded. Now look at an interesting situation. Suppose demand and supply curve shift at the same time. What will be the overall outcome in terms of quantity traded as well as equilibrium price? One thing we know, when demand and supply curves increase or shift to the right, we know for sure there'll be an increase in quantity traded. But as far as price goes, an increase in demand causes an increase in equilibrium price, an increase in supply causes a decrease in equilibrium price. So beforehand, we just cannot predict what will happen to equilibrium price. And this would depend on looking at the relative strength of shifts of demand and supply curves. For example, if the increase in demand curve, however measured, is greater than increase in supply, or the demand side factors dominate over the supply side factors, in such a case we would expect an increase in equilibrium price. If the extent of increase in demand equals increase in supply, they will cancel out each other and we would have no change in equilibrium price. And if the increase in demand is less than increase in supply, in such a case we would expect a decrease in equilibrium price. And this completes our discussion of how and why prices change. Thank you for your time.